And now I'm going to take a short break again, and we don't have too much left here, but I'm going to give a trilemma for biblical Unitarianism and try to give something of a positive argument against it here in a second. Okay, so thankfully not too much more to go on this. What's gone up to this point is all a negative argument. Okay, so what I've done is undercut the argument in favor of biblical Unitarianism. There really is no argument in favor of biblical Unitarianism, no good argument. The argument that Tuggy and other biblical Unitarians present at best would be successful only against later Western egalitarian forms of Trinitarianism. It really doesn't have anything to do with monarchical Trinitarianism, which is the older and characteristically Eastern or Eastern Orthodox view. So they just don't have an argument against that. So there is no argument for so that whole picture. I'll wrap up with this at the end too. But that whole picture that Tuggy starts with is just completely wrong, as we've seen. And as we have seen, monarchical Trinitarianism, it's not something I'm making up, and it's not just some weird thing where one or two crazy nut jobs believe it or they're reading it into people. It's a standard view in Orthodox theology. It is and always has been. It's the reason. It's not something that people can kind of give up on. It's something even the Catholic Church acknowledges. That it's there and it's a problem for their ecumenical discussions with the Orthodox. It's at the root of the Great Schism. It's there in the early fathers, the later fathers, everything. So it's not something you could ignore or get around. And it essentially shows that the entire biblical Unitarian project is just doomed. They don't have an argument. They have no argument for biblical Unitarianism. But you might say, if you're a biblical Unitarian, you might say, well, I don't have any particularly good argument against, Trinitarianism in general. Maybe we have a good argument against the Western form of Trinitarianism. I don't have a good argument, at least in a biblical sort of argument, against monarchical Eastern Orthodox Trinitarian theology. But I just, don't buy it. Right? I just don't believe it. And I just rather, I'd rather believe something else, or I don't know, when I when I read the Bible, I just kind of get something else out of it or whatever. So you might admit you don't really have any particularly great argument against Trinitarianism. You don't believe in it, right? So what I've done is I've given a negative argument that says, okay, yeah, you don't have any argument against us, but I haven't really given any positive argument against biblical Unitarianism. I haven't said that you couldn't be a biblical Unitarian. So here, just briefly, I want to kind of piggyback on some of the things that Gregory of Nyssa has said, and really, in a way, this is kind of an interpretation and or elaboration of Gregory of Nyssa and some things in St. Basil and others. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. This is kind of a topic for another day, but I just want to give you kind of a taste of why you might think that the foregoing issues are actually the beginnings of an argument against biblical Unitarianism. So it may be not only is there no good reason to be a Unitarian and to reject Trinitarianism, but it might be that you really can't be a biblical Unitarian. And here's why. So I'm going to call this the Trinitarian sandwich. What I'm going to argue is at least potentially, and again, I'm not going to go into super great detail on this, but potentially it looks like biblical Unitarianism may sort of get sandwiched between monarchical Trinitarianism and egalitarian Trinitarianism, and it may be that there's no way to navigate the issue here. So here's the issue, right? Biblical Unitarians want to identify God and the Father. That's kind of the big motivation for it, even though that doesn't really actually work, as we've seen, because there are monarchical forms of Trinitarianism, but that's their motivation, right? The monarchy of the Father is their big motivation. So here's the problem, right, is that if you identify God and the Father too strongly, you end up being a monarchical Trinitarian. So remember back to the passage where I kind of analyzed the logic of Gregory of Nyssa's argument against the Eunomians. If you say that fatherhood is essential to God, so there's always been a God, there's always been a father, well, then if there's always been a father, there's always been a son, right? And so then the son is not a creature, he's divine too. And that just is monarchical Trinitarianism. That actually is the meaning of the homoousion. Again, this is the thing where egalitarians try to act like it's very ambiguous and hard to understand or whatever, but it's actually completely clear if you just read it in the Greek and you don't come to it with any preconceived theological notions. At least it's clear enough. And I would be perfectly willing to defend that at greater length, but for the time being, the point is that's just the meaning. That's the point behind the homoousion, is just to say that the Son is not a creature. He's uncreated. He's divine, just like the Father. And that's the result that you get if you say that there's always been a God, there's always been a Father, right? There's always been a Father, and there's always been a Son. So if you identify God and the Father too strongly, you end up just collapsing into monarchical Trinitarianism, right? But on the other hand, if you don't identify God and the Father strongly enough, then you could be a biblical Unitarian, but the egalitarians are going to come back then and say, well, why not just be an egalitarian Trinitarian, right? So let's say you say, well, there's always been a God, but there hasn't always been a Father. So God and the Father are, kind of identical, but they don't exactly have all of their qualities in common. So, for example, their existence, which is a big, important feature of a thing, right? And so God has always existed. The Father hasn't. So they're not quite identical, but they're sort of one in number. They're numerically one, but without identity, right? That was Mike Ray and Jeff Brower's view. And what's going to happen, then if you do that, then the egalitarians like Mike Ray and Jeff Brower are going to come along and say, well, I mean, gosh, if you're saying that God and the Father are numerically one, but they're not quite identical because they don't have the same essential properties and modal properties and so forth, then then what was so bad about egalitarian Trinitarianism, right? What was so bad about their model of the Trinity? Now, you might just say, yeah, but, I just don't buy it. Whatever, that's fine. But I do think there's something highly ironic about the situation if it turns out that in order to consistently be a biblical Unitarian, you have to end up sort of borrowing kind of wonky metaphysics from egalitarian Trinitarians in order to make your view work. To me, that says something's wrong. There's a deeper issue going on here, and something went wrong, because the picture was supposed to be that biblical Unitarianism didn't have to rely on weird metaphysics, right? And now what we're seeing is, well, actually it does. And so if that's the case, well, then it looks like, gosh, it's actually monarchical Trinitarianism that does justice to the Bible and doesn't have to rely on any kind of weird metaphysics or anything, right? So that's really the view that doesn't have any problems with it. It just fits hand in glove with the Bible and doesn't need any kind of weird metaphysics or equivocations on important terms or whatever to kind of do some tricks and sort of make it work. So at the very least, what happens is biblical Unitarianism gets put in a spot where it, in fact, it's not that it kind of has everything going for it except tradition. It has the same kind of problems as it accuses egalitarian Trinitarianism of having. So it's in kind of the same boat. It's actually worse off, right? Because egalitarians can say, well, we have this long tradition and our view is really popular, and your view's not, right? And we have wonky metaphysics, but so do you, right? So then you'd have this situation where biblical Unitarianism would have all the same kind of problems as egalitarianism if biblical Unitarians end up having to borrow metaphysics from the egalitarians to make their view work, right? then it's going to have the same negatives. It's just going to lack the positive. So it's going to end up being worse off, right? So not exactly refutation, but it's an inversion of that picture, right? So instead of biblical Unitarianism being kind of on top and Trinitarianism on bottom, it's just going to be exactly flipped over. And the problem is so that biblical Unitarians do want to maintain this biblical identification of God and the Father, but of course you don't want to collapse into monarchical Trinitarianism. And so you have to maintain that not all the same things are true of God and the Father, which is just another way of saying you have to, if you're going to be a biblical Unitarian, it looks like you have to say that Leibniz's law breaks down somehow. So it looks like you're going to have to, in some way, not quite affirm that God and the Father are Leibnizianly identical, because you can't just substitute those two terms, salva veritate, as we say, saving the truth value. You can't just switch out God and the Father in any context and it still ends up being a true statement, because God existed in 5000 BC, but if you're a biblical Unitarian, the Father didn't, or at least you'd have to say something like the Father existed, but he wasn't the Father. So maybe fatherhood's not essential to the Father, but we'll talk about that on the next couple of slides here. And then on the other hand, right, so it's not clear, whatever you do to make sense out of that, it's just not going to be clear why an egalitarian Trinitarian couldn't take the same treatment on board and then extend that to the Son and the Holy Spirit too. Whatever you say to kind of pry apart God and the Father in some way. That's just a very brief sketch. I'm going to say this in a slightly more technical way. So for those of you who aren't really into, analytic philosophy of language and so forth, some of this might go over your head a little bit, but I think Tuggy, if he watches this, should understand it. And some of you, if you're into analytic philosophy, might understand it. So here's another kind of way of getting at the issue. You could put it this way. Do the terms God and Father refer directly or via their descriptive content? So usually analytic philosophers have kind of distinguished this issue. There's a theory about names and definite descriptions like God and Father. There's different theories about how they work, how the semantics of them work. So, excuse me. On one view, the direct reference view, as it's called, these terms, certain terms, at least proper names and these kind of things, just refer directly to their bearers. They don't refer to them because of any descriptive content. So what I mean by that, for example, the Holy Roman Empire famously is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, right? So, but it refers to this kingdom. So it clearly doesn't refer to it in virtue of the descriptive content, right? In virtue of the description or the meanings of the terms, because if it referred to that thing in virtue of the kingdom actually being holy and Roman and an empire, then the term actually would fail to refer to what it's supposed to refer to, because that kingdom was not holy and it was not Roman, it was not an empire, right? So again, it's not really the meanings of the terms that make it refer to what it refers to. It just refers directly to that thing regardless of what it means. That's direct reference. A lot of times people think proper names work this way. So John and Frank, John doesn't really have a definition. Frank doesn't have a definition. It just refers directly to the thing. But there's a problem with that view. And the problem is, it's called the Frege problem, and the problem is that identity statements kind of become trivial. So in this case, the claim that God is the Father, is numerically identical to the Father, would become trivial and uninformative. And here's why. The way the Frege problem works is, let's take something like Batman and Bruce Wayne. Okay, let's suppose that Bruce Wayne, being a proper name, just refers directly to this particular man. not because he has any particular qualities that that are part of the meaning of the name. It just refers directly to him. And let's suppose that Batman doesn't have any particular meaning either. In other words, the meaning is just the reference, just the man, right? So when I say that Batman is Bruce Wayne, I'm really just saying this guy is identical to this guy. But and likewise, if I said Batman is Batman, I would be saying this guy is identical to this guy. And if I said Bruce Wayne is Bruce Wayne, I'd just be saying this guy is identical to this guy. So the problem with this view, one of the problems with it, one at least alleged problem, is that it looks like it would have the result that the claim that Bruce Wayne is Bruce Wayne would be logically equivalent to the claim that Bruce Wayne is Batman. Because both of them, the meaning of both of them would just be this particular guy is identical to himself. But here's the problem with that. Saying that Bruce Wayne is not important. It's not interesting. It's not informative. No one denies that, right? If I told you that Bruce Wayne is identical to Bruce Wayne, you wouldn't feel like you learned anything, right? But if I tell you that Bruce Wayne is Batman, and you didn't already know that, you'd say, oh, wow, that's informative. That's interesting. I learned something, right? Bruce Wayne equals Bruce Wayne didn't really tell me any information I didn't already know, but Bruce Wayne equals Batman told me a lot. So how can they be logically equivalent statements when one seems to be informative and the other one seems not to be informative? And in the context of the current issue with the doctrine of the Trinity, if you said that the word God and the word Father just referred directly to some entity, not via any descriptive content, then you get that same problem. Then God equals the Father just becomes logically equivalent to God equals God, or the Father equals the Father. And the problem then is everybody, Trinitarians, Unitarians, everybody says that the Father equals the Father. Everybody admits that God equals God. And on this view of the philosophy of language or of semantics, you'd say, well, those are logically equivalent. So since Trinitarians believe that God is God, they automatically are affirming that God is the Father. And those are just kind of logically equivalent claims. That seems obviously wrong, right? It seems like biblical Unitarians want to say that when they say and insist that God equals the Father, surely they want to say that's an important and informative claim, and that it's not something that Trinitarians just automatically believe. And so the direct reference theory, I think, it causes. It has this problem in general. It has this difficulty. But anyway, that's how it surfaces in this particular context. And so I'm not saying that that can't be fixed. I like the direct reference theory in many ways in philosophy of language. I mean, I think it's, in many ways, there's a lot of good to it. And this is something that anyone with a direct reference theory has to deal with. But the point that I want to make is just that biblical Unitarians need to deal with that issue. If that's how they want to understand things, then they need to tell us if God and the Father refer directly, then what are they saying? What does their statement mean? And how can it be informative? They owe us an account of that. On the other hand, suppose that God and the Father refer via their descriptive content. So in the way that a phrase like the President of the United States, that doesn't refer in the way that Bob and Jack and John refer, right? Just directly to a person. that refers to someone in virtue of the descriptive content, right? So in other words, the way that term refers is right now, it just refers to whoever actually has the quality of being the president of the United States. So right now it refers to Donald Trump because he happens to have the appropriate qualities or bear the appropriate relations to the United States. So right now that term refers to Donald Trump, but a few years ago it referred to Barack Obama because Barack Obama had that quality and Donald Trump didn't, right? And later on it's going to refer to someone else. So it will change its reference. It can change its reference from time to time. Now, necessarily, the President of the United States will always have the quality of being the President of the United States. Okay, so that quality, because the quality of the property is built into the definition, that's always going to be there. That property is always going to be there. It's just that it may or may not refer to some individual. It might change who it refers to, might fail to refer to anyone. If you went back 200 BC or something, the President of the United States, that phrase wouldn't refer to anyone. Maybe in the future at some point, if the United States ceases to exist, it won't refer to anyone either. So it would change who it refers to, it changes reference, but that quality of being the president will always be with that referent, whoever it is. So that's just another way that a term can refer. It can refer to a thing because it has this property in its definition, and this entity has the appropriate property, and so that makes the term refer to it. But again, that raises the problem that then God can't be identical to the Father without having the property of being the Father, right? And like we said before, so if God has always been identical to the Father, then he has always had the property of being the Father, right? So in just the same way that I can't say that Donald Trump has always been the President of the United States unless I could say that he had always had the property of being the President of the United States, right? So because the phrase President of the United States doesn't just refer to somebody in the way that Holy Roman Empire just kind of refers, even though the thing doesn't really fit the description. President of the United States is a legitimate description, and it just refers to whoever has the right properties. So again, I can't say Donald Trump has always been the president, has eternally been the president, because I can't say that Donald Trump has always had the appropriate property or quality. And again, to bring it back to our situation, if God has always been identical to the Father, and Father refers via its descriptive content, then the Father's always had the property being the Father, right? God has always had the property being the Father. That's that eternal fatherhood premise that we ran into before with Gregory of Nyssa, right? So if you work out the semantics in this way, then God's eternal identity with the Father would just entail the eternity, the eternal fatherhood premise, right? The eternity of God's fatherhood. And so, again, as I argued above with Nyssa's argument, you can't have the property of being a father without having a son, right? So again, to just go step by step, if you work the semantics out the first way, then the claim that God is the Father just becomes trivial. If you work the semantics out the second way, then God can't eternally be the Father. He can't have always been the Father if he didn't always have the property of being the Father. He can't always have the property of being a father if he didn't always have a son. So in that case, if God has always been the Father, then there's always been a Son. So you just collapse into monarchical Trinitarianism. So the way this argument I'm presenting works is, on one way of doing things, biblical Unitarians just kind of turn out to be saying something trivial, which I don't think they want to say. On the other way, you get this problem that if you say God's always been the Father, then actually you just become a monarchical Trinitarian. It collapses into monarchical Trinitarianism. So remember Tuggy's definitions here. Right, I put in bold here at the bottom where he says 1 through 3 are eternally the case. There's one God who's numerically identical to the one Jesus called Father, and that's eternally the case. Remember I said arguably that actually requires monarchical Trinitarianism. So here's why. Again, if you say that the word Father just refers directly, well, then this whole thing just becomes trivial. If you say it refers via descriptive content, then if you say it's eternally the case that God is numerically identical to the Father, then you have to say it's eternally the case that he has the property of being the Father, and then you have to say it's eternally the case that there exists a Son, right? And that means the Son's not a creature, and you get the whole 9 yards. You're a monarchical Trinitarian now. So that's what I call the unfinished business of Unitarian theorizing. That's just kind of a inside joke, maybe. I guess Tuggy has a paper called The Unfinished Business of Trinitarian Theorizing, where, again, I'm not sure he's that up on the Church Fathers, but he kind of tries to make the case, well, Trinitarians have all these kind of loose ends to tie up, and they need to figure things out. And what I would say is just, it actually turns out that that's the case for biblical Unitarians. Because, again, just depending on how they try to work out the details of their view, it looks like they're either going to just collapse into monarchical Trinitarianism, or they're going to have to actually deny the biblical identification of God with the Father, or they're going to have to start sort of borrowing weird metaphysics from egalitarian Trinitarians, which just, doesn't mean that it's false, but it means that dialectically, it's actually them that are in this bad, difficult situation with having to rely on weird metaphysics and so forth. Plus, they don't have the benefit of any kind of tradition being on their side, so they just kind of end up in last place, as it were. So anyway, that's just kind of the beginning of an argument. I don't want to go into a ton of details. It's already gone on for quite some time. And that's kind of a subject for a different paper. There's lots of ways that Tuggy could respond, and there's lots of twists and turns that argument could take. But the point is not, it's that it's just not obvious how a Unitarian could respond without relying on some kind of tricky metaphysics or philosophy of language again. So just the sort of thing Unitarians normally want to accuse Trinitarians of. And so whatever Unitarians come up with, the question is going to be, why can't egalitarians use the same strategy? I said the example is Aristotle. This is just one example. So the way that Aristotle kind of works out these issues is he just says essentially that terms always do refer via some kind of descriptive content. And so he just kind of goes with the claim that identity claims are not necessarily trivial in his view, but he kind of goes with the claim that things all have these essential qualities, and depending on how we refer to a thing will tell us what its essential qualities is. But then what he does is he has this kind of weird take on identity, where identity is not necessarily Leibnizian for Aristotle, but there's ways of being, like Mike Ray and Jeff Brower talk about, you can be numerically one with something without being absolutely identical with it. And so that's the way he kind of gets around this issue. He kind of gets the best of both worlds in a way. So everything ends up being informative, and yes, you do have these essential everything has these essential qualities, but because the way that he treats identity, he kind of makes it work. So he gets around this by massaging his understanding of identity, and it's not that he rejects Leibnizian identity. I think it's just that he has other forms of identity. But anyway, point being, he has a more complicated view on identity. But the problem there is, if you tried to take that sort of route, right? That's exactly what Jeff Brower and Mike Ray used to articulate their egalitarian form of Trinitarianism. So you're not going to be able to accuse them of wonky metaphysics, it actually would be a case, again, of Unitarians borrowing this weird metaphysics, or allegedly weird metaphysics, from egalitarians to make their view work. And I think that's highly, highly ironic if biblical Unitarians end up having to actually steal metaphysics from the Trinitarians to try to make their view work and not collapse into monarchical Trinitarianism. Now, historically, the way that Arians and other Arians, I'll just say, the way that they made it work was they actually did kind of shy away from the identification of God and the Father. And a lot of people don't get this because they think of it as, the Arians believed that the one God was the Father, because they're the subordinationists and whatever. But as we saw, Alexander of Alexandria and all the way up to Gregory of Nyssa toward the end of the Trinitarian controversy, they actually, Alexander says, no, the problem with Arianism is that Arius says there was a time when God was not the Father, right? And if you look at Arius's actual creed, in fact, I have that on the next slide, so I'm going to show you what he does. It's very interesting because the really philosophically astute Arians, like Arius himself and Eunomius, not so much Ulfilas, frankly, and I don't know if Ulfilas, the apostle to the Goths, was that philosophically sophisticated or not. I'm not quite sure what to think about them. But anyway, Arius and Eunomius, certainly, their strategy was just to kind of shy away from the identification of God and Father. So I'll show you this. This is from Arius's creed, his letter to Alexander of Alexandria, his bishop, when Alexander asked him, why don't you put in writing exactly what you believe. And what Arius does is, you might think, well, he says, he's going to say, I believe in one God the Father. But as we've seen, you say God is the Father, and then you got to start asking if he's always been the Father, and if so, then has he always had a Son? Here's what Arius says. He says, we acknowledge one God, alone unbegotten, alone everlasting, alone without beginning, alone true, alone having immortality, alone wise, alone good, alone sovereign judge, governor, and provider of all, unalterable and unchangeable, just and good, God of the law and the prophets in the New Testament, who begat an only begotten Son before time and the ages, through whom he also made both the ages and all that was made, who begot him not in appearance but in reality, and he made him, the Son, subsist at the Father's own will, unalterable and unchangeable, the perfect creature of God. Well, you notice the word Father never shows up. I mean, you read it and you kind of, if you're not really careful with it, you get the impression, well, he's talking about God the Father, right? I mean, he talks about one, unbegotten, right? Alone unbegotten, who begot an only begotten Son, But he doesn't define God as the Father, right? The Creed says we believe in one God, the Father, right? It just defines God as the Father. And I think the point there is to affirm that eternal fatherhood or essential fatherhood premise. Father is part of the definition of God on the patristic view. It's part of who and what God, the one God, the true God is the Father. It's not part of his kind essence. It's what in analytic philosophy would call part of the individual essence of God. But it's nonetheless essential to him. But Arius doesn't ever say that God is the Father. He says, well, there's one God. He's alone unbegotten, right? So Arius is willing to say that unbegottenness is part of the divine nature and it's essential to God, right? It's essential to God that he be unbegotten, but he doesn't want to say it's essential to God that he be a father, because then his view would collapse into monarchical Trinitarianism. And then he says that God begat, and then at this point he even adds before the ages, but again, he still doesn't define God as Father. He wants to leave the Son's existence contingent, at least. Arius started out by saying that there was a time when the Son didn't exist, and I think he seems to have kind of backed away from that later and says, okay, well, the Son, began to exist before time, but he still wants it to be at least contingent that the Son exists. And you can see how it says that the Father made the Son to subsist at the Father's will, right? So there are going to be possible worlds, at least, where the Son doesn't exist, but the Father does. And so that's why he doesn't define God as Father in here. And that's the same thing can be said for Eunomius' creed. We saw that in the passage with Gregory of Nyssa. He takes Eunomius to task because Eunomius says, well, he is one and alone and unchanging and the only God, and all this, but he won't say it's the Father, right? So they're really philosophically astute Arians shied away from saying that the one God is the Father. But again, what biblical Unitarianism needs to do is they want to maintain that biblical identification of God and the Father. And I just want to point out that's never been done before. Okay, so we've never, historically, again, the Arians, at least the really philosophical ones, tried to kind of shy away from that identification, precisely because they don't want to collapse into monarchical Trinitarianism. But biblical Unitarianism wants to maintain that strong monarchy view, but not collapse into monarchical Trinitarianism, right? That's exactly what's going to happen if God is essentially or eternally a Father. So you have to say that God is the Father, but he hasn't always been the Father, which is kind of a weird view. And you have to make that distinction between God and the Father in such a way that egalitarian Trinitarians can't just do the same thing. You're not just borrowing their metaphysics, which would allow them to extend the same treatment to the Son and the Spirit. So that's the Trinitarian sandwich, as I call it. So how do you do that? How do you navigate that issue? And that's what I call the unfinished business of Unitarian theorizing. So congratulations, we've made it to the conclusion. To wrap up, without keeping one eye, so to speak, on history, Tuggy's definitions might seem reasonable. They might even seem, roughly equivalent to my definitions. And that looks like it results in this really bleak picture for Trinitarianism. This one where the doctrine of the Trinity has only the weight of tradition behind it, and biblical Unitarianism has only a lack of tradition to count against it. But when we get our history right and we get the neglected doctrine of the monarchy back into view, we end up with exactly the reverse situation, right? So the strongest objections to Trinitarianism, that it relies on weird metaphysics or problematic equivocations and so forth, that it doesn't do justice to the biblical presentation of God as Father. All of those strongest objections to Trinitarianism just completely lose their force, okay? And then also we see that actually biblical Unitarianism is going to need some modifications so that it doesn't just collapse into monarchical Trinitarianism. And those modifications may be fatal, but at the very least, they're going to put it in a much weaker position, right? So the biblical Unitarians are going to end up having to kind of borrow metaphysics from the egalitarians. And now they not only are unpopular and non-traditional, but they also are using the same wonky metaphysics that the egalitarians are. So it's going to put biblical Unitarianism, at the very least, it's going to put it in last place. So monarchical Trinitarianism will be the most likely option. Egalitarians are going to be second, and biblical Unitarians last, right? Once you get that doctrine of the monarchy back into view, the picture just flips on its head. The landscape of this debate in philosophical theology changes drastically, and so my main point that I really want to say here, the history really does make a difference. Okay, to all of you budding analytic theologians out there, let this be a case study. when you try to attack a doctrine that has such a long history and intricate history as the doctrine of the Trinity, without really knowing the history, you just make messes, right? So the history matters, and if you really want to address the issue, you need to know the history. And that is that. And thank you for making it this long. For those of you who've actually listened to the whole thing, I wish I had a candy bar or some kind of reward for you. But thanks for listening, and I may do some more of these in the future. So, and thanks to those of you who are going to host this on your websites.